The toll of war was evident in him. He sat in silence, chain-smoking, his eyes distant and weary, the weight of what he had witnessed too much to express. The severe wounds he had tended to, the lives he had tried and often failed to save, had left their scars. Hello friends, welcome back to another episode of the Doc Wales Diaries. I'm so grateful to have you here with me again, and it's a privilege to share this journey with you. I'd like to start by reflecting on another verse that's close to my heart. Psalm 46 and verse 1. God is our refuge and strength, and an ever-present help in trouble. This verse has been a blessing to me, especially during the darkest days of my service. It's a reminder that even in the midst of chaos and uncertainty, there's a source of strength we can lean on, a steady presence that carried me through when the weight of the world felt unbearable. In this episode, I will continue sharing my experiences in Kosovo after the 1998 war, a time of devastation and uncertainty, yet also one of resilience and hope. Though the scars of conflict remained, so did the unwavering strength of those who refused to be defined by tragedy. These are the moments that have stayed with me, shaping my understanding of both hardship and the unbreakable human spirit. On June the 12th, 1999, after months of brutal conflict, Serbian forces had finally withdrawn, and the grim reality of war gave way to the uncertainty of peace. Serbian leader Slobodan Milosevic had, under intense pressure, agreed to the peace terms. It was a decision that would change the region forever, marking the beginning of a new chapter for Kosovo, but one that was still clouded by the echoes of violence. The arrival of the Kosovo force, KFOR, a NATO-led peacekeeping force, was supposed to bring stability. It wasn't supposed to be a fight, but in many ways it felt like one. Thousands of soldiers, their faces hardened by years of conflict, began to move into Kosovo. They were ready for anything, but what they found wasn't the full-scale battle they'd prepared for. It was something far more complex, a delicate balance between military might and diplomatic negotiation. The lead unit for this mission was the British-led Allied Rapid Reaction Corps, under the command of Lieutenant General Mike Jackson. KFOR was not just a force, it was a symbol of hope for many, a lifeline to those caught in the crossfire of war. But for the soldiers, the reality was far different. They weren't coming in as liberators, they were entering a land divided, where old wounds were fresh, and the air was thick with suspicion. British troops from the 4th Armoured and 5th Airborne Brigades took the lead, their boots hitting the ground in the rubble of what had once been homes and communities. Alongside them were French, German, and Italian soldiers, each with their own mission, but all under the same banner: to restore peace. But peace, it seemed, was something far more elusive than any of them had imagined. As NATO forces began to enter Kosovo, all eyes turned to Pristina. The soldiers arrived expecting a smooth occupation, but what they didn't anticipate was the presence of Russian troops already at the airport. The Russian soldiers, no less, they were determined to secure their place in the post-war Kosovo, and they had arrived first. The news was like a thunderclap, unsettling NATO's carefully laid plans. The two forces, Russian and NATO, were face to face for the first time in the midst of a war-torn city. For Kosovo's people, this moment would be remembered as one of both hope and fear. The arrival of KFOR promised safety, but it was also a reminder that peace was never guaranteed, that every fragile agreement could be torn apart at any moment. Peace, they realized, was not a certainty, but a journey, one that would require patience, compromise, and an unwavering commitment to a vision that even then seemed far out of reach. Our first stop as we travelled back into Kosovo was the ancient city of Prizren. It was a city steeped in history and culture. We were greeted warmly by a delightful couple who took great care of an old mosque and fort that had been standing there for centuries. What made their story truly unique, however, was the intersection of their faiths and history within their home. The wife, a devout Christian, and the husband, a Muslim cleric. They had lived lives far from the traditions they now upheld. In their youth, they had been ardent communists, fervently supporting Tito's regime and the atheist ideals it propagated. Yet over the years, both had undergone a profound transformation. They had rediscovered their faiths, rekindling not only their religious beliefs, but also their deep love for one another. We shared a meal, their hospitality humbling us, and we were then treated to a tour of the ancient mosque. The walls, steeped in history, seemed to tell a story of their own. Our journey continued toward Pristina, the capital, and there we stayed with the family of our double agent, the courier, a man whose life had been shaped by conflict and secrecy. His uncle, a surgeon, had recently returned from months of service with the Kosovo Liberation Army, KLA, in the northwest of Albania. The toll of war was evident in him. He sat in silence, chain-smoking, his eyes distant and weary, the weight of what he had witnessed too much to express. The severe wounds he had tended to, the lives he had tried and often failed to save, had left their scars. It was clear he was battling post-traumatic stress, a silent casualty of the war. We could only imagine the stories he carried, stories too heavy to share. As I turned a corner, soap bubbles, millions of them, floated down the street. I was puzzled for a moment until I saw a British soldier standing by the side of his tank, doing his laundry in a big bowl. Soap suds were everywhere, turning the street into a surreal, bubble-filled scene. "I wish me mum was here," he exclaimed with a thick Liverpudlian accent, clearly more in need of comfort than he realized. Later, I shared the story with my mother over a satellite phone, a device graciously loaned to me by a CNN presenter. My mother, with her ever-present concern, thought I was somehow under the protection of the British Army. She laughed nervously as I described the pantomime-like spectacle that I had just witnessed. Widow Twanky and his wishy-washy laundry with a mountain of bubbles. Unfortunately, I was unable to reach my wife on the phone, so the message, however inaccurate, was relayed to her by my panicked mother. She told Stella I'd somehow become part of the British Army. Well, The fog of war often leaves behind a trail of confusion, but it also brings with it many compelling and haunting stories. Some are tales of courage, others of fear, and still others of unintended consequences that would ever and forever shape the way the world would see this conflict. Our journey took us close to the Serbian police headquarters, a place infamous for its role in the war. A NATO smart bomb aimed with precision struck the building, collapsing it entirely. Remarkably, not a single adjacent building or even the outer walls were damaged. It was a strike designed not for mass destruction, but for a specific targeted elimination. This wasn't the first time NATO had struck with such precision. A similar, albeit tragic, incident occurred at the Chinese embassy in Belgrade. On May the 7th, 1999, NATO bombs hit the embassy, tragically killing 3 Chinese journalists and provoking a storm of outrage in China. The United States and NATO initially claimed the bombing was a tragic mistake, blaming an outdated map provided by the CIA. However, doubts soon surfaced. A joint investigation by the Observer, United Kingdom, and Politiken, Denmark, suggested that the bombing was no accident. The report alleged that NATO had intentionally targeted the embassy because it was being used as a relay station for the Yugoslav army and its radio signals. The Chinese government's response was swift and harsh. President Jiang Zemin condemned the bombing, accusing the US of using its economic and military dominance to interfere in the internal affairs of sovereign nations. The bombing was branded as a new form of colonialism, an unjust war, lacking both morality and legality. At the time, the international press largely accepted NATO's version, but as the truth emerged, it became clear that what had happened was far more complicated than a simple mistake. The world, it seemed, was still struggling to understand the full consequences of this war. In the city of Pristina, the tension of war was palpable. A dramatic standoff unfolded at Pristina airport when British and French forces blocked Russian tanks from reaching Kosovo. The Russian forces had been trying to assist the Serb troops in their destruction of the Kosovar villages and the KLA resistance. I witnessed firsthand the retreat of these ancient Russian tanks, their engines coughing out black fumes as they withdrew from the mountain passes, leaving behind a trail of destruction. As if the situation needed more complexity, the Russians quickly marked their tanks with K4, an insignia attempting to pass themselves off as part of the NATO peacekeeping force. This, however, wasn't reported by the international media until much later. The uneasy peacekeeping mission soon became even more strained when Russian forces, uncoordinated with NATO, arrived at Pristina airport ahead of NATO's forces. The Russians, expecting to operate in an independent sector of Kosovo, found themselves in a standoff with NATO forces. Unprepared for what would come, one of the most tense moments of this standoff came when NATO Supreme Commander Wesley Clark ordered that NATO vehicles block the runway to prevent the Russian reinforcements. KFOR Commander General Mike Jackson famously refused to carry out the order, stating, I'm not having my soldiers responsible for starting World War III. The Russian involvement in Kosovo continued to be a source of tension. It wasn't until June 2000 that the full extent of Russian arms trade relationships with Yugoslavia was revealed, leading to retaliation and further violence. Despite all this, the international media often reported second or third-hand accounts of these events, which left me questioning the accuracy and the objectivity of the stories being told. Going home, my friend Bob and I finally left the chaos behind us, flying out through Malpensa Airport in Milan. There my cousin Joan, who had married her Italian husband Pepe Tetamante and lived in Como, she welcomed us at the airport. Over a warm supper, we traded stories for laughter and then crashed at a local hotel before catching our flight to Boston. At Logan Airport, Boston, Bob's wife Linda and their daughters threw him a hero's welcome. My wife, Stella, sensing I needed a buffer before diving back into my busy medical practice, she whisked me off to a seaside guest house in Rockport, Massachusetts. She was right. After months and weeks in a war zone, I needed rest and recuperation. Hey, we had a hero surprise a few months later. A surprise came knocking. The Boston Celtics, yes, the famous Celtics, reached out. Our hospital staff in Beverly, unbeknown to us, had nominated Bob and me for their Heroes Within tribute. At a game at the Celtics with the crowd roaring, we both got a trophy. Bob, a die-hard basketball fan, was over the moon. Our host was his idol, Hall of Famer J.J. White. Photos from our mission flashed across the Boston Garden's big screen. For a night, we weren't just witnesses to war, we were celebrated for it. You know, there's been a lasting bond between Bob and I. We stayed close after Kosovo, brothers forged in turmoil, but he passed away in 2023 from Parkinson's disease, leaving behind a legacy that hit me deep. In his book that he'd written on Eastern Orthodoxy, he wrote a dedication to the long-suffering wife of Dr. Steve Price. Hey, thanks Bob, a true friend, but a brother in Christ. I'll see you someday soon. Well folks, thank you for joining me today on Doc Wales Diaries. Next time, we're going to explore the devastation of Sri Lanka's tsunami and the double blow of Hurricanes Katrina and Rita, and many more stories. I invite you to join me as we witness how God's presence can be seen even in the darkest of times. Until then, may His peace and grace be with you. Doc Wales.